Right, so we are going to continue our conversation of topic 4, America Comes of Age. Don't forget to pay close attention to these vocabulary terms as you see them. We talked a little bit about these, be able to do sort of things that you should be able to accomplish by the time we're done with this topic. We went through them in the first part 1 of the America Comes of Age presentation. So if you want to hear those read and discussed again, then just go back to that. But otherwise, we're going to jump right in. So we're going to talk about some progressive reforms now, specifically in regard to women. In the early 1900s, a growing number of women were no longer content to have a limited role in society. Women activists helped bring about progressive reforms and won the right to vote. In the years ahead, women would continue to struggle to expand their roles and rights. So here is a picture of a woman at work in a factory, a cigar factory in this particular case. And if you think back to part 1 of this conversation, we watched that little video about the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. And that was a female event, a female workforce that was struck down there. So women are definitely involved in the workforce and engaged in work in these unsanitary conditions, just as men and even children are. So women enrolled in higher education. So you can see when this graph begins to go up, and it's during the progressive era. So we need to think about what things during this time period spur this desire for women wanting to be educated, as well as society saying it's okay for women to be educated. So both of those things. One of the boldest goals of progressive women was suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote, not suffering, but the right to vote. They argued that women participating in the democratic process through voting was the only way to make sure that the government would protect children, foster education, and support family life. That's going to be their argument. As Jane Addams, and if you remember her from the Settlement House movement and the Whole House, she says women need the vote because political issues reach inside the home. So if the argument against women is that there are places in the home, then Jane Addams and others say, then we need the right to vote because issues that you're deciding on in the public sphere impact the private sphere at home. This is a picture of Susan B. Anthony. She and women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to work together to create organizations like the National Women's Suffrage Association. There will be other women's suffrage associations like the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So there will be more than one group, but they will both ultimately be working towards the same goal, even if their methods are slightly different. So here are a few more women. There's Susan B. Anthony again as an older woman in the center. On the left, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then on the right, you have Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. All of these women are important American women progressives. The first convention to call for women's suffrage is in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And again, remember that suffrage is the right to vote. There are lots of challenges to this fight for suffrage. Many women's rights advocates had also been abolitionists. They had focused on the right for African Americans to be able to vote after the Civil War and are disappointed when the 14th and 15th Amendments that guarantee citizenship rights and voting rights for African Americans do not include voting and citizenship rights for women. There are two sort of schools of thought about how to gain suffrage. The first is a constitutional amendment. The National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, advocate for this. You lobby the federal government, you focus on electing progressive presidents, progressive leaders, and then you lobby for a constitutional amendment. But the other side says allow the states to do it first. So everyone should focus on a local fight, that you advocate for states passing laws in individual areas to allow for women's suffrage. That would be the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by women like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. This is a really interesting little flyer here. At the bottom it says Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage. It says, men, you are making the world safe for democracy and also safe for women. that your mothers, sisters, and wives may never have to suffer as the women of Belgium and France have suffered. All women thank you. Men manage most of our business. Our government is a very big business. Most women want men to manage our government. Only a few women want suffrage. Shall these few women force all women into politics? Can women do their best outside of politics? Our hands are full already with work which only women can do. Women are free from the duty of fighting, protect us, and our right to be free from political duties. So this is a women's organization assuring men that not all women think this way and imploring men to not support a suffrage amendment for women. The two groups that we just discussed are going to join forces in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The first goal is for women to become politically engaged. Women like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt will be the ones who, although they sort of are standing on the shoulders of these women who came before them, they will be the ones who are going to sort of be at the helm when suffrage is finally ratified as a 19th Amendment in 1920. And this is a really famous picture in the bottom. It says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And they're lobbying Woodrow Wilson there. Votes for women. The 19th Amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex."
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are some things you need to know to sound smart about the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the one that guaranteed women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. But the truth is, women had been voting in American elections for long before that. In the early years of the Republic, for example, there were some places where women voted, in the state of New Jersey until 1807. But in most cases, women were denied the right to vote in the 19th century. They started agitating for the right to vote openly and in public in the late 1840s and early 1850s after meetings in places like Seneca Falls in New York. During the Civil War period, women were involved in the fight against slavery and the fight to save the Union. After the Civil War, leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony thought that their fight to end slavery would get them included in the amendments like the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the rights to former slaves, and they lost. It was a devastating blow to their cause, and so they reorganized themselves in a long campaign for suffrage. Sometimes they did this on a state-by-state or territory-by-territory basis, especially effective out west. Then there were women led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who organized the National Woman's Suffrage Association. They were fighting to change the Constitution. Sometimes they fought in the courts. They actually tried to vote. Susan B. Anthony got herself arrested at one point doing that. Ultimately, these fights converged at the beginning of the 20th century and during the era of World War I. There was a serious campaign to try to change the Constitution. They had what they called silent sentinels posted outside the White House with protest signs. Those silent sentinels were arrested by municipal authorities and imprisoned. It was a stark moment in the history of women's rights, women being imprisoned, and in some cases force-fed. Eventually, women gained the right to vote in states like New York. They convinced Woodrow Wilson to support women's suffrage, and finally, by 1919, the Congress had endorsed, after much struggle, this proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and women began voting wholesale across the country in the presidential election of 1920.
Young people in large numbers.
There's a really great story about women's suffrage in Tennessee, where a man was, and there's some debate about, which man this happened to and how accurate this story I'm about to tell is. But it is true that there is a Tennessee politician who was set to vote no to ratify the 19th Amendment, but he got a letter from his mother, and she was like, "Don't you dare," essentially, and Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18th of 1920. So anyway, I just always think that that's a great Tennessee connection, Tennessee story there. So major organizations of the progressive era that have a high female participation rate, and there are a lot here. Not all of them supported women's suffrage, including the NAOWS, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. It says, until the passage of the 19th Amendment, they argued that women's suffrage would impede women from making social changes, that women would become political and they would lose this sort of moral high ground that men often assigned to women, and would therefore make them less able to make true societal change. And this is a really good map of when states achieve suffrage. And if you look out west, all those states in the very dark purple had full suffrage before 1900. So remember that there was a debate within these women's rights organizations. Do you go after a constitutional amendment, or do you go after suffrage at the state level first? And you can see that there's a lot of traction with that. It's those gold states, with the exception of New Mexico, really in the east and southeast, that are only going to grant women's suffrage with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Some states had partial suffrage. Some states had full suffrage for women before that time. Women, there's certainly a minority that the progressives use to sort of achieve their ends, and there are progressive women who gain some serious ground here. But remember that the progressives are also going to be promoters of this idea of a uniform American culture, and there's a lot of white supremacy sort of sewed into these progressive ideas. And I'm not trying to say all progressives are white supremacists, but that is an idea that exists within progressivism. And so we would be remiss if we didn't talk about other minority groups in America, including African Americans, Native Americans, as well as other religious minority groups, and how they were treated, what their lives were like in the progressive era. So as prejudice and discrimination against minorities continued even as the progressive movement got underway. But in the spirit of progressivism, African Americans, Latinos, Catholics, Jews, and new immigrant groups worked to help themselves. Their efforts paved the way for the era of civil rights that would follow decades later. This is a picture from another settlement house that provided services specifically to immigrants. There are also going to be African Americans that are important to know about, and these two that are mentioned here on this chart are going to be hopefully a review for us because we talked about them with Reconstruction, Booker T. Washington, and then later W.E.B. Du Bois. And you can see not just that they have different ideas, but they're really different generations. So Booker T. Washington sort of represents an older idea of civil rights, and W.E.B. Du Bois is really going to be pushing and challenging that older view of civil rights. Washington believes African Americans had to achieve economic independence before civil rights, and W.E.B. Du Bois believed that Black Americans had to demand their social and civil rights or else become permanent victims of racism. African Americans are not alone in seeking rights. Individuals and organizations of diverse ethnic and religious groups spoke out about unfair treatment and took action by creating self-help organizations. For example, in northern cities, Catholic parishes often offered a variety of social services to immigrants. In Chicago, a network of Polish Catholic groups grew so strong that it earned the nickname American Warsaw. To be continued.